In the wake of the Healthcare.gov project, the United States government learned some lessons about software engineering. For example, hiring contractors to build a long-term service is not a viable strategy for building good software. 18F is an organization that is building the 21st century digital government in the spirit of America's top tech companies, and finding success through engineering with a long-term dedication and focus. In today's episode, I had a chance to speak to Sarah Allen, a Presidential Innovation Fellow who was there at the birth of 18F. She explained in particular the pains that the government was facing and the ways that 18F is contributing to bringing technology to arguably the most challenging industry to modernize, the government. But before we get to this episode, here's a short message about our sponsor. I love being a software engineer because of how easy it is to build side projects, and I've built countless side projects. I've built a social gambling application, a dating website backend that had 0 users, a stock trading music rhythm application for Android, and I think every developer should have side projects. So when I have a web app that I want to deploy and share, I want to show my friends my most recent project that nobody will care about, I use DigitalOcean to quickly spin up a server and host my projects. And who knows, if one day one of my apps takes off and goes viral and people actually do care, I can easily scale using DigitalOcean's flexible pricing plan. Companies like TaskRabbit that have grown rapidly have used DigitalOcean for this very reason. But until this happens, I will happily stick with the $5 a month plan. Sign up with promo code SEDaily to get a free $10 credit as a listener of our show and start building your apps. We would love to see what listeners build, so send us an email showing us your project. I've also interviewed Moisey Uretsky, who is the co-founder of DigitalOcean, and he mentioned that the ease of use and the flexibility is why they built the service in the first place. That DigitalOcean interview is one of my favorite episodes. Moisey talks about bleeding in a data center. He says, you don't know how hard it is to do a cloud hosting service until you've bled in a data center. It's really interesting. So speaking of which, let's get on with this episode of Software Engineering Daily. Sarah Allen is a software developer and entrepreneur who spent 9 years at Macromedia, creating products like Flash, Shockwave, and After Effects. And since then, she has worked at several companies in software development. She currently works with 18F, which is part of the United States Digital Service, otherwise known as the USDS. Sarah, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you. It's great to be talking with you this morning.
At 18F, you are working on building the 21st century digital government. That is the high-level goal, building the 21st century digital government. Describe that goal to me in more granular terms.
I'd be delighted to, but first I have to say that I do not speak for the U.S. government. In case anybody was confused, I'm not a representative on this podcast. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. That said, I've been delighted to be involved with the creation of these new digital services. And when we say a 21st century government, what we're seeing is that people are using their smartphones, they're online, and we have the potential to actually deliver better services to our people at dramatically lower cost if we just do what is common practice in the industry. We are a country that created Amazon and Twitter and Facebook, and we can't file our tax returns online. We have to hire people. Like, there are so many problems that are technically simple, but challenging at the scale the government does them. And so the other thing is there are people who don't have access to technology. And if we let some people access services with technology, we'd have more staff to help the people who don't have technology. And at some point, I think, all of the young people are going to grow up and we'll all be connected and it will be normal to fill out forms on our smartphones, and be able to access government services 24/7.
So, as you mentioned, the United States, we've built Amazon and Twitter and these other companies. And 18F, which is the division of the USDS that you work at, is built in the spirit of America's top tech startups. At a fundamental level, is there any difference between building a successful company versus building a successful government organization?
I think there is. There are a lot of things in common. However, we're building things for our colleagues. So it's analogous to being the software services arm of a large company, where you don't have to make a profit, but you have to do good work that is moving the company forward. So in that way, we don't have the same goals as a startup, of course, because we're trying to move forward the mission of the United States of America, and we are working within an organization that is 2.7 million employees. So that doesn't include the military. And so that's an enormous organization that we're working within. And in many ways, private sector dynamics happen because it's so big. But in other ways, we have an opportunity and an obligation to create some things that will always have a, quote, small market, right? Some of our things are for federal employees. We could save billions of dollars by doing things for a relatively small number of people. And that's, it's very different from a software business.
Okay, so we'll get into some of the tactics of how that works, but let's first discuss 18F. What does the name 18F mean?
It's because we were started at the General Services Administration headquarters, which is at 18th and F Street in Washington,
okay.
D.C.
Okay, and the tagline is "Delivery is the strategy." What does that mean?
So that is actually borrowed from the UK government digital service, where they had the strategy is delivery. We just turned it around a little bit to emphasize delivery. The point is that you can't really understand these new techniques of lean and agile and human-centered design by being taught them. You have to do them. So we deliver digital services in partnership with agencies and our government colleagues so that they get it, right? So that they really see how it feels. Agile isn't, waterfall carved up into 2-week delivery timeframes. But it's
right, okay.
hard to tell from the outside.
So I think what you're getting at here is that there's often this narrative around government versus business, where government maybe inherently has to move slower, and that's some sort of axiom. And that's not actually the case, is what we've found in the early experiments with the USDS and the success stories. So, in your forecasting, do you think that this slowness to the bureaucracy is that something that you can change with the spirit of the delivery is the strategy that you've talked about?
I think certainly in the executive branch, that's absolutely true. I think policy and legislation, there's a certain measured pace that ought to proceed in, right? We're working in an area where, if you recall the Constitution, you have the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch. This area of the government, which is where all the staff, most of the staff, not the Congress people, not the judges, but most of the staff work, is just about executing on the business of our government. And that ought to happen at the pace of business, at the pace of technology, at the pace of humans.
So does it have something to do with the size of the constituency that you have that has some limiting effect on the pace that you can move at?
Well, I think that there is. That's an interesting question. I do think. I think that the main limiting factor is that most of the procedures and regulations were designed when we traveled across the country on horseback.
Right.
And I think the changing regulations is slow, right? And taking advantage of new technology has been challenging, even though the government has done all sorts of innovative things. I mean, the reason we have the internet, right, is because a lot of it was government funded. The reason we have GPS is because the government puts satellites in space.
Sure.
We have what we have because of the government. We just can't, we have not historically done the government's business routinely, like in an innovative way, right? We haven't given that attention to how the government does its business.
Yeah, and like, it's important to note that we have these smartphones that we haven't had for a very long time, so it's hard to know how to reframe what government should look like with that level of consumer level computing. So in an ideal world, what is the relationship between politics and software?
Well, in my mind, politics does not equal government.
Oh, okay.
So there's there's a set of things, like I wouldn't say that adhering to the Constitution is like political, right? That we have certain rights in our country, and we have over time decided to provide certain services to our people. And protecting those rights and providing those services is just the business of government. It's not politics. There are edges to that where there's debate about, like, really the smallest percent of what the government does. Should we do more of this or less of that? If you look at it writ large, if you look at the whole budget, if you look about everything the government does, what is like top of mind in the political sphere is a tiny portion of what the government does.
Okay, interesting. So we have talked about some of the high level. I want to talk about 18F in a more low level tactical way. So you're working on Open Opportunities, which is a program to foster cross-agency collaboration. What is an example of a way in which two agencies could collaborate more closely?
So this is really the way that it's working today is about individual employees collaborating. So the most common use cases are almost every agency has like a weblog, Twitter account. They are responsible for publishing documents. There's actually regulations about publishing them in plain language. There's a lot of writing that needs to happen. And often people responsible for that are looking for other voices. So guest blogging is a very popular type of opportunity where you'll have individuals that want to get into communications, but they don't have that experience. They don't have bylines. So they'll sign up to do those tasks. Their manager will, it'll be part of their career growth path. And then for another agency, they're getting their mission work done and they're helping a federal colleague. So those are sort of very simple. And then there's, on the technical side, there'll be, I need a stand up a WordPress instance, or I need to, I need a widget for this. There's a wide spectrum of tasks, and of course, graphic design tasks as well, where you see the real power of this is where there's a need to have people bring something from lots of different agencies. So recently, the White House wanted to create a crowdsourcing toolkit because a lot of different agencies are experimenting with this idea of crowdsourcing information. It's kind of meta because Open Opportunities is itself a crowdsourcing platform. But the person from the White House who was leading this effort posted an opportunity and said that they wanted to pull together a group of people to create this toolkit. So people who had individual separate crowdsourcing initiatives across the government, dozens of these people across dozens of agencies brought their own particular narrow expertise and then learned about everybody else's. So everybody is learning about what the different people across government are doing, in this case with a very similar sort of methodology / technology, and pulled together a publication that then was shared with the world.
I see.
And what the other example of that would be if there was a topical thing, right, where multiple agencies actually work on the same issues. So somebody might be developing a report or investigating a certain topic, and you could imagine that there might be a scientist from Health and Human Services, and somebody from Housing and Urban Development, and somebody from, a different agency, Department of Energy, who might all be touching on the same societal concern.
So when I think about collaboration, and I think about like modern collaboration tools for a technology company, I think like Slack, Google Docs, Trello. Are these things? Can these things be used within the government, or do you have to, or can you not use them?
Well, we actually at 18F have used all those tools. So they can be used within the government, but every individual agency has to approve the terms of service. There's specific clauses that are required by the federal government in a terms of service, so that once one agency has adopted a technology, it's then easier for another agency because they've made, one agency has made sure it's federally compliant. But then each agency has its own separate legal counsel, and they have to just review and approve every terms of service that is agreed to by that agency, because they're separate entities that are authorized by Congress separately. And in very small, it wouldn't, to my knowledge, happen from a piece of software, but they do have different authorities.
Can you talk about the context in which 18F was created? Like, what was the conversation, and what was did you have the idea for the mission? Was the idea for the mission of 18F understood up front, or was it more like a group of people that just wanted to get together and work on government problems, and they gradually settled on a mission? Or what's the origin story?
I actually heard the very early part of the origin story recently. I was a Presidential Innovation Fellow in 2013, and at that time there were 43 of us, and about a dozen, maybe 18 of us were there for 6 months. And I have a family in San Francisco, so after my 6 months, I was definitely coming back here and done with government service. However, a number of people had moved to DC, and they were working on, or maybe they originally were in DC, and they were working on things that they really saw as needing to survive past that 6 months, or they just felt like, okay, we're not done yet. There's still more to do here. So it was, the idea was sparked during the government shutdown of 2013. You may recall that we had a crisis in Congress, as seems to happen almost every year. And the government actually shut down for, I think, a little over a week. And during that time, many of the Presidential Innovation Fellows were forbidden to work. So I was, at that time, a Smithsonian Trust employee, which is a private-public organization. So I was allowed to work because the funding was, because of funding rules. Like, depending on the funding rules, you could or could not work. But most of the fellows were forbidden from working, and so they were hanging out together, talking about what they were going to do after December. And they came up with this idea of staying at GSA and continuing this work of changing government.
Okay, and I want to put this in more historical context, because 18F is an organization within the USDS. And when was the USDS formally created? Like, what was the story behind that?
I didn't want to correct you earlier, but 18F is a separate organization from the United States Digital Services.
I'm totally sorry.
That's
okay,
all right.
I misunderstood.
So the USDS was created after 18F. Like, kind of a funny story. 18F wanted to call itself the U.S. Digital Services, but at that time, the copyright to that term or the trademark was owned by the post office. So our lawyers said we couldn't call ourselves the U.S. Digital Service. And they put forth 20 names. 18F was the only name the lawyers approved. So they called themselves 18F. And at that time, it wasn't at all clear whether they would be able to do anything, right? That they had, they secured authorization from GSA to provide services to other agencies in a cost reimbursable basis. So this is something that
I'm sorry. What is GSA?
The General Services Administration was started during the Truman administration. One of the fun things about working for the government is now I know a lot more about U.S. history. So it was started to optimize how the government spent money. And its first thing that it did was the Public Building Service. So every federal building in the United States is run by the General Services Administration. And then they rent out offices to different agencies so that if you go to a federal building, you could see the Department of Agriculture and the Social Security Administration in the same building. And that was not only a cost savings, but a convenience for the citizens and fostered cross-agency communication.
Okay.
So the second thing they did was the acquisitions, where if you buy, they can buy in bulk because they buy for multiple agencies. And then this is really a new initiative to say, well, let's do that from a digital service standpoint.
Okay. Engineers are always looking to simplify. To simplify testing and deployment, engineers turn to CodeShip. CodeShip is continuous integration and delivery as a service. With CodeShip, your tests are executed against your code automatically whenever you push to GitHub or Bitbucket. On Software Engineering Daily, we've done several shows about DevOps, and continuous deployment is key to DevOps. It's a great way to break down the wall of confusion between development and operations. Managing your own testing infrastructure is painful. That's why you want a service like CodeShip to do it for you. If you have a huge number of tests, you can use CodeShip's Parallel CI to run all your tests in parallel. CodeShip will spin up containers on their own infrastructure to run your tests in parallel. If the code passes your tests, CodeShip will deploy it automatically to your users. Companies like Product Hunt are already using CodeShip to speed up and simplify development. To sign up for free and start shipping today, go to codeship.com. Or to try out CodeShip's new Docker platform, go to codeship.com/Docker. Well, okay, so since your ear is on the ground somewhat to things that are going on in the cross section of government and technology, I do have some curiosities about your take on stuff that's going on there. So like Healthcare.gov, for example, that seems to have been a blessing in disguise because the government, tried to spin this project off with a bunch of contractors and the project fell off the rails. And then with all that fallout, it seems like people in government kind of learned, oh, you can't hire a bunch of mercenary contractors and expect the job to get done. And I mean, do you think that's that was an important lesson for the government to learn, and that has led to these things like the USDS
Well, Healthcare.gov led directly to the USDS because Mikey Dickerson ended up really leading the Healthcare.gov effort under Todd Park, our former CTO, and he was a site reliability engineer from Google and just came in and did what he felt was obvious, but was a different, it wasn't something that the government did. And a lot of it was not that the contractors were not interested in doing those things or not, hadn't suggested them, but frequently things happen because contractors are brought in and told what to do, and then they're not authorized to change the rules. So, for example, it used to be considered illegal to use AWS in most agencies. So they literally had an open line to the White House. And if anything got in their way, they could escalate it to any agency. And it was multiple agencies involved in Healthcare.gov, if you recall. So sometimes getting things done was very hard because a decision would have to happen across multiple agencies at very high levels. So, so that process of understanding what it took to recover Healthcare.gov, the fact that it happened in government times, very short amount of time, and using like not rocket science. Like Mikey's given a lot of talks about like, this is just like it's normal procedure at these high scale sites. And, he always talks about, he says things like, on the planet that I come from, this is normal.
Oh, that's funny. What was the stigma against AWS?
Well, there are security rules, right, that we have to follow that are very important. So it was a matter of going through and validating that it could conform to security rules. And then in some cases, there were regulations that got in the way. Like, they were well-meaning regulations that were probably created in the, 60s, 70s, or 80s, but like the Veterans Administration has a regulation that says that if there is a security breach, you have to take the hard drive and put it in an evidence bag. So then it's against they can't conform to the regulation if they could put anything on the cloud.
Right. You can't put a data center in an evidence bag.
Exactly. So these are just hurdles you have to work through. And what happened was the Office of Science and Technology policy, which is in the White House, formerly led by Todd Park as CTO and now led by Megan Smith, gets involved in unsticking these things. And that has been a magical thing. And now, they have like a lawyer who works for them now. It's great. So,
okay, but this Amazon is now building a cloud entirely for the U.S. government. Do you think this is what is the future of this relationship between technology companies and government? Is this is this a promising roadmap, or is this like Amazon or Google or whatever will become another Booz Allen?
Well, we try pretty hard to, and there's a lot of rules that mean that we can't play favorites with technology companies, even when there appears to be a clear leader. One of the great things about the way we do things at 18F is that we are repeatedly creating and modifying creating new websites for other federal agencies. So over and over again, we're having to go through the very time-consuming security checklist process. And so that's probably the thing that we started first on, because in order to launch anything, we have to do this security checklist process, which is important, right? Because the federal government websites do get attacked by foreign countries. Or, maybe but the traffic's coming from wherever, who knows what's going on, but we don't want our services to be attacked. We don't want our PII to be vulnerable. And, and the government has not been doing so great on that. And we felt it was very, very important we get that right. And so we made it a precondition that we host on AWS.
Right.
But then gradually we started to do, you have to do all this tooling, and it was, I was writing like chef scripts for my, for open opportunities at the beginning. And then everybody was like creating their own deployment things. And we ended up largely because of the kind of top-notch people that we have here, just saying, oh, well, this is kind of idiotic. We're spending all this time doing all this stuff manually. And there's this open source platform as a service called Cloud Foundry. So one of our engineers just stood it up and said, hey, let's try this. And now all of our websites are deployed on Cloud Foundry, and it stood up for the federal government. And we're going to be offering that to other agencies as a service. And it will end up being much cheaper than an analogous service that we would go to a vendor for.
Cloud Foundry runs on Pivotal Labs servers, or
Pivotal Labs is a contributor to it, big contributor. I think they have 100 people working on it, but it is an open source platform. So we have it installed. We have
So you have your own servers?
Yeah. Well, it's on AWS.
Oh, it's on AWS.
What that means is that if in the fullness of time, AWS turned out to be not the right answer for us. We could move on to a different thing.
Right. So this is the layer of offboarding you can have. So, okay, that's great. So you get this. So you get the security feature. So one thing I was going to ask was like, has the dialogue managed to shift from, because like for a while there was this perception, and I think there is still this perception in places like banking or whatever, that AWS is somehow less secure than on-prem, which is not correct, as I understand. It sounds like you want to be on AWS specifically because it's more secure. And what it sounds like you're saying is that you get the features, the security features of AWS, but you also get modularity with the Cloud Foundry.
Yes, and I think that the key thing to know about security, which I'm sure you know, most of the listeners probably know, is that we live in a very dynamic world, right? The biggest vulnerabilities are at the application layer typically, or an operating system that hasn't been upgraded, or a library that hasn't been upgraded. And so we need to move at the pace of technology when it comes to keeping our software secure. And if you have physical boxes that have to be, administered separately, that is a huge risk in terms of being able to upgrade software when a vulnerability is found. And that is the key difference in this virtualization we call the cloud.
How long do you think it'll be till we have a technologist president?
Well, it is my hope that the next generation, not the generations that are in school now, but the one after that every child will be a technologist. We need to be able to understand technology the same way that we need to be good writers. Now, everybody who graduates from high school is not a good writer, but every president has been. And so I think that this is a fundamental skill. We need to understand technology the way that we understand photosynthesis. I have never once in my adult life used my knowledge of photosynthesis, but it helps me understand the world. When I learn about climate change, it's because of what I learned in high school that leads me to understand the real problems of our world. So I think that technology needs to be they need to be nouns and verbs that are understood by our populace.
Right. So does that mean teaching every kid to code, or what exactly?
I think every kid should learn to code, where the goal is learning problem solving. It's a tool for problem solving. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is when I learned to code, which was a little while ago, it was I think it was in like the 80s, and it was the sort of common thinking that in the future, everyone would have to learn to code to use a computer. And then, and so there was this frenzy about like teaching kids to code. There were like computer camps and stuff like that. And then then the Mac came out and Windows came out, and people realized that you didn't have to know how to code to use a computer. And I think that changed the narrative. And what's really interesting now is the Learn to Code movement is focused on like software development. But I think the opportunity is really in being able to use these tools, because every single tool that I use has some advanced feature that's like coding. Using a spreadsheet, certainly. Using Microsoft Word styles, like those end up being like, you have to really understand hierarchy and like it's almost like a declarative syntax. There's, your mail filters. Now you can hook up your calendar to your web page if you know just a little bit of things. That glue is coding. And we have to teach our kids how to be facile with that type of tool.
Right. Okay, cool. So this is a great segue into one of your past positions, which was working with Bridge Foundry and Rails Bridge, which is, Bridge Foundry is an organization that partners with underserved communities to create effective environments for learning technical skills. Tell me about the formation and the evolution of Rails Bridge and Bridge Foundry and your involvement in those.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually, I'm currently serving as a volunteer program director of Bridge Foundry, so I continue to be involved.
Excellent.
So Rails Bridge was started in 2009. I had learned Rails and Ruby in late 2008 when I wanted to do consulting. And my first project happened to be a Ruby on Rails project. And so I taught myself Ruby on Rails. And I started to go to meetups. And the first Ruby meetup I went to, there was one other woman in like 70 or 80 people. And I went up and introduced myself. And that was Sarah May. And I was, despite it being always odd to be, to personally double the number of women in the room, I felt that the men there really treated me as an engineer, not as a woman, because you go to some places and then, they think you're a recruiter, or they think you're somebody's girlfriend, or you must be in marketing. And that's that's a fairly uncomfortable experience. But I didn't find that in the Ruby community. And I felt that the online spaces where I was learning were very friendly. And then I went to there was a local conference, the Golden Gate Ruby Conference, and there were 200 people and 6 women. Now, I was really used to being there, being few women. I came from, this proprietary world of software. I did a lot of graphics. We had in my prior company, we had a Java-based platform. And in those environments, there was always 10% to 20% women. You go to a conference and you could feel that you're in the minority, but it wasn't like you were the only. You could see other women scattered in the room. Whereas at one point at the Golden Gate Ruby Conference, I was sitting in the balcony and I could not see another female in the whole place. And I got to talking to Sarah May in a break, and I was telling her that I had been meaning to learn Ruby on Rails for 3 years. I always have a list of things I want to learn, right? At that time, it was like, should I learn Ruby on Rails? Should I get better at Python? Because our docs have a Python stack. There was a number of interesting things going on with Skype had just had plugins, and I was an AV person. Should I do, there was always there's always 5 or 6 things that I'm oh, I want to learn that thing. Mm-hmm. But then, you can only pick one every so often. And I thought there's lots of other women like me. And if we just borrowed somebody's conference room and taught a class in Ruby on Rails, I bet that we could find 5 or 10 women a month who would do this. And so we did the math that way. If we got 10 to 20 women every month to show up at a workshop, and we had them every month for a year, we could triple the number of women at this conference the following year. So that was our idea. And there was, so we were doing this workshop thing. In parallel, my kid was in elementary school, and I was volunteering to teach computer programming classes. So I was using Shoes, which I actually learned about at that conference, which was a really fun environment for teaching kids that happened to use Ruby, and it was a graphical environment. It's really fun.
What is Shoes? Is that a subset of Ruby? And
it's all of Ruby, but it had so it was created by Why the Lucky Stiff. Do you recall this character? So this in the Ruby community,
I'm shaking my head if listeners don't know.
In the Ruby community, there was a persona called Why the Lucky Stiff that didn't have there was no human identity associated with Why the Lucky Stiff, but he was very prolific. He wrote a lot of things. He made up songs. He had a whole bunch of open source libraries that he created, some of them very, very useful, some of them silly. And one of the things that he created was Shoes, which ran on Windows and Mac. And so that was a really important characteristic, that it ran on Windows, and it had graphical user interface for Ruby. And I think Ruby is a good learning language because there isn't a lot of extra syntax for kids to learn because like they can find the letters pretty well, but all the special characters are not things that kids are familiar with. So not having the extra parentheses and things was helpful, I think. And then having this sort of whimsical language called choose, I think, was fun for the kids.
Yes.
But anyhow, Why the Lucky Stiff disappeared several years later as somebody likened it to one of those like Tibetan sand paintings. Persona was on the world and then disappeared.
Right. Yeah. Maybe he became Startup L. Jackson.
So he went by Y, and somebody joked that he was going to reemerge working on Perl 6 and call himself Win. But anyhow, it was like a funny thing in the Ruby community. Now it's, I think that the successor to that is Kids Ruby, where that's a similar environment that has kind of been rewritten from scratch. So the origins of Railsbridge. So I was working on this, teaching kids to code, and Sarah May and I had decided to do this workshop. And then in the middle of that, there was a unfortunate event where a fellow had some slides in his talk that were not what you'd expect to see at a technical conference. Which I've mentioned this to some people outside our industry who are shocked that people put screens of scantily clad women on conference slides. But I wrote a blog post about that, and I had never seen a blog post about such a thing, and I'd never heard that this actually had happened since like the 40s. And I was like really nervous about doing that because I was new in the community. So I wrote a blog post about how I didn't think that this, these slides were particularly appropriate. And there was like a whoosh uproar, as happens on Twitter and the internet. And
like Gamergate?
It was what was different. It was maybe an analogous uproar, but what was amazing to me and heartwarming is that after an initial, there was an initial reaction, which was, sort of the usual hubbub and retweets and so forth. And then David Hannermeyer Hansen, unfortunately, sent a tweet that said, I wish there were more pictures of beautiful women on slides at conferences. And that was what kind of blew up the internet. And what was heartwarming was the Ruby community's response was for people to step up and put it in a different context. So one guy was like, I don't want to get involved in the turmoil, but I think that there's a problem in our industry, so I'm going to start a fund and use it for teaching women and kids to code. And this was before Railsbridge, right? And so he put, $250 or something in this fund, and it was like one of these pledgy things where other people could contribute to. So he was like, I want to take the conversation into a different direction. And then there was an amazing blog post, which was Stand Up and Be Counted by an engineer who was a dad. And he said, I don't want to comment on what's going on, but I want to stand up and say that I want to have conferences that when my daughters grow up, I would want them to go to. And that's the kind of community that I want to create. And so there were numerous very positive, affirmative posts about creating gender equality, about creating safe spaces that transformed the conversation in a way that was I just did not expect.
But what I don't understand is the type of person that says, I don't want to get involved with this, but I'm setting up a website, or I don't want to get involved with this, but I'm setting up a fund. Aren't those kind of why don't you just get involved in the conversation?
I think because the conversation was, DHH is an idiot. or
Right.
what do you mean this is sexist? What do you mean, like, you're wrong? You're doing it wrong. You're bad. Like, the conversation
literally
on Twitter,
not get involved in the waste of time on Twitter.
Yes.
Where you're having low impact.
And also not be involved. Like, let's not criticize the person who sparked this. The people who sparked the conversation. That bad things just happened, okay? Let's stop talking about the bad incident and start talking about that we have a widespread problem that we need to fix.
So interesting, because I did a week of shows about women in tech, and I was like trying to figure out how do I approach this properly? Because like when I was doing some preliminary research for it, I was like, God, this situation is bleak. And, so the first, kind of early interviews I was doing, I was like coming at it from a position of bleakness. And that's probably not the most helpful angle. The most helpful angle is like starting from a discussion. If you're having the conclusion I came to was my strategy became discuss technology with women. If you want to do shows about women in tech, don't start with, so what do you think about the bleakness of the women in tech phenomenon? Like, right? I mean, does that sound correct to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I was actually just updating. I was updating my about with like my speaking engagements for the last year, and I have like a CV that I like update, and I had press highlights, and I was noticing that I think out of like 10 like that I had on my list there, 8 of them are about women in tech. Right?
Yeah.
Like, so that I'm somebody who has created things that almost every human on the planet who has a computer has used. However, the press about me is about my gender. Like, there's something odd about that. I think that engineers often don't get written about. So I mean, do you know the engineer, lead engineer on, name your favorite product? Most people don't. So, if somebody doesn't want to write about my engineering exploits, fine. However, if I'm newsworthy, I would like to be newsworthy for my actual accomplishments rather than being the woman who did that.
Right. Okay, cool. So, I was going to talk about that near the end, but I'm glad that we touched on the women in tech conversation stuff. But let's go back to Bridge Foundry a bit. You told me the origin story.
Well, let me wrap up the origin story, and I'll just do it quickly.
Go for it, please.
So, Rails Bridge was really started by Mike Gunderloy, who created a list of every person who'd said a positive thing about how to change the situation. And this was in the 3 weeks up to RailsConf that this whole hubbub happened. And so he really pulled together that conversation and created this organization, Rails Bridge. And then Sarah May, and the other rule that he came up with, which I really, really liked, was we're only going to do things as an organization if somebody steps up and says, I will do that. So there's lots of ideas, but we will announce that we're making this organization before RailsConf. And so that anybody else so we don't want this to be this secret private group thing. Like, we'll open up the list and we will announce these initiatives, right? We are the collection of these initiatives, but we will only do the initiatives where somebody steps up and says, I will do that. So I said I'd do the Teaching Kids initiative. Sarah May said she would do the workshops so that I didn't have to lead 2 things. And we set off to do the workshops. And then it was the workshops that really took off. So the first workshop, we spent 3 weeks brainstorming how we would find 10 to 20 women. And then when we finally planned it, we had a wait list in less than 24 hours.
Wow.
And the narrative at the time, if you remember in 2009, there was a lot of, wasn't as much conversation about why women, where are the women? But the conversation that did exist, often people would say, well, maybe women just aren't interested, because it is kind of geeky and boring and stuff and technical, and maybe women are interested in more important things. And what was great about the demand for the workshops, and every single workshop that year and almost every workshop that we've ever had across the globe has had a wait list. And a year later, nobody was saying, maybe women aren't interested.
Right. So it was extremely influential. Okay, so where is it at today?
So in 2013, we noticed that a lot of people were creating similar organizations and crediting RailsBridge for that model. But we really thought that there was power in being one organization, but that the name RailsBridge alienated people. We'd done things in JavaScript and Ruby, and it was called Rails because it came out of the Rails community. But then it seemed that people didn't, like the Python people, and didn't want to be affiliated with a Rails organization. And so we refactored the organization, calling the sort of organization that did everything Bridge Foundry, and then just the workshops RailsBridge. And then that renaming was very successful because we defined the idea that somebody could make a new bridge. And so we have Mobile Bridge and Closure Bridge and Go Bridge. And now we have a model where anyone who has a new technology can create a new bridge.
Okay, got it. So that makes sense. So if people want to check it out, they can look up they can look up Bridge Foundry or RailsBridge. So our time is drawing near, but I want to go back in time even further. We, speaking to what you said, we haven't talked much about the technologies that you were building early on in your career, which are pretty interesting. I mean, 20 years ago, you were working at Macromedia, which developed Flash and Shockwave and lots of other technologies that I personally have used. I remember I made a music video in Flash that was pretty fun and really enjoyable to make. So take me back to that time. What was it like to build a technology product in 1995?
Well, 1995 was a fun time. It was the beginnings of the web. I mean, if you recall, the web standard was released in 1993. I actually went to Macromedia because I wanted to learn about the internet. At that time, most people had never used a web browser. Most people in college had used one, especially if they were in technology. But I had to actually get a friend of mine to show me a browser before I went into an interview, right? I literally went into interview at Macromedia to create web technology when I had seen a browser once. And we would, so Shockwave was the first technology to be developed at Macromedia. Flash was developed in parallel at a startup company and then acquired in 96. And in 1995, there was Netscape 1.2 was out, right? That I think supported images. That was big. And people were talking about how maybe images would ruin the web because that was going to use up all the bandwidth on the internet. And we created Shockwave. And Shockwave was created in 6 months, which was lightning fast. No one did anything in 6 months. Release cycles were 12 to 18 months, and those were the fast-moving companies. So it was fascinating, and I became hooked on this. One, just working on something that you were on the edge of invention, where it wasn't like the internet was new. The fundamentals were the same. I could read about TCP/IP, which was created, when I was a kid. But for example, we released the Netscape plugin, and then when we wanted to create the control for IE, we hired a contractor who'd written one IE control before, right? It had just been released. Nobody had done it, and we just needed acceleration. And then he was going on vacation before we released it. So I sat down with him on the phone and I walked through the code with him, and so that I could make any modifications that were needed. And the next day, somebody stopped by my cube and said, I need to work on an ActiveX control. And I hear you're the expert at Macromedia. And of course, I was, because I was the person who had spent a day learning about this technology. And the idea that I could become expert at something in a day was both humbling and kind of exciting. So I kind of got hooked on this, like always learn new things that aren't really new because they're just a bunch of APIs that somebody just made up, but give you new powers and let you do things that somebody else can't do yet. The other thing is I also got kind of hooked at having really wide reach because I'd done After Effects, which had a big impact on the video production industry. And it had, at least thousands of users, if not tens of thousands of users at that point. But Shockwave, when it was released, I remember Bruce Hunt was leading the team at the time, and he, went up to the web people and he talked to them about really being able to accept a lot of downloads, and did we have enough bandwidth? And people thought it was just crazy because, like, who was going to download this thing? How would people even hear about it? And but he made sure that we could have 100,000 downloads a day, and everybody was like, "That's crazy." Shockwave had 300,000 downloads in its first week.
Wow.
Which would be big today.
Right.
And the internet was like, I don't know, a lot smaller than. The number of people on the web was a lot smaller then.
What were the tools and practices that you were using back in 1995?
Well, Macromedia was the other reason I came to Macromedia was because I'd always done Mac software, and I wanted to learn about Windows because I felt like you had to in the day. So the way that we did that is we had every engineer had a Mac and a Windows machine on their desk, and then we used. I think we used Perforce for source code control.
And C#, you're saying?
It was, C++.
Windows? Oh, C++.
It was before C# was invented.
Oh, okay.
So, so a lot of it was in C. Director was actually originally written in Pascal. So Director is the authoring tool for Shockwave. And it was originally written in Pascal, and they cross-compiled it to C. So the engine in the middle of it was machine-generated C code. But then it was all wrapped in C++ classes. So, we and if we had to compile the whole authoring tool, it took an hour and a half. That's why all engineers knew how to juggle at that point. You would have to amuse yourself for an hour and a half while your machine compiled. It was delightful. So automated testing was kind of a new thing. We worked on it for many years in the 90s. It was, and waterfall was, when I was in college, was considered to be a best practice. It was instead of the Mythical Man month, right, where you pretended that you could build everything at once and divide it into 1,000 subcomponents and divide them amongst 1,000 people and have everybody build a different thing and have it magically go together. Well, let's write the specification and then let's actually test all the components together and then test them together when they're more fully featured, and then so on. And that was an innovation in before my time. And so this was where there was a lot of experimentation when Macromedia acquired the company that made Freehand. I can't remember the name of them. They had this thing they called Cyclone, which was I think a forerunner to Agile, where they would have a QA engineer and a development engineer work together. And the QA engineer would write the spec and the development engineer would implement it. And then the QA engineer would test it. And of course, this worked out really well because often our QA engineers were our users because they were expert at our tools because we made platforms and creative tools.
So you lived through the nuclear winter of software. When you look at what's going on today, do you see any similarities to the run-up to the nuclear winter, or are we in more of a fundamental boom that is going to push us beyond anything that happened in the 90s?
I think that there's some stupid things happening in the industry, but it's not as widespread. Mm-hmm. So there are, I remember when I was at Macromedia in the early 2000s, our stock went from 120 to 6.
Wow.
In I don't know, a month. It was so fast. And, and every time it would go down, you'd be like, oh, I'll just hang on to my options because, it's just a dip until everything was underwater. And there were 200 to 300 open jobs on the Macromedia website, and that was common. Every internet company had 200 to 300 job postings. Several months later, there were 0 across the whole industry. Senior engineers couldn't find jobs. I had an internship position open in 2002 at Laszlo Systems. I had senior engineers applying for it.
Oh my God.
Because they couldn't find, they were just, it was like musical chairs. All of a sudden there were no seats. So
right.
I don't think that will happen again because people are making money. And people are providing services, and there are more people on the internet who are just doing their basic work.
Right. It's not fake companies. Like I read this book recently about some of the companies that were created during kind of the run up to the nuclear winter. There's this book called Effed Companies, and it's just like about all these like fake. They don't even sound like real companies. They just sound like fake shell companies, and they raised tons of money, and things do seem different now. There does seem to be more of a fundamental vector that's driving this stuff. Okay, well, Sarah, it's been awesome talking to you. Do you have anything else to impart to the listeners as closing thoughts?
I think the main thing that I'd like to impart to everybody writing software is there's great power in the people who write the code. This is something that led me to not consider a software engineering position when I was in college, because I felt like to be a software engineer was to be told what to do. Now, of course, it's very different. There's this mythos that software engineers have all the power, but it's true that that's really a very few number. And most of the people who are put in that category aren't even software engineers, right? They're company founders who may have written code at one point in their lives, but they're not engineers. That often you're in a position as an individual where you are creating the thing. You are making it. So beware that when someone tells you what to do, they don't understand the consequences of it as well as you do. They don't understand the opportunity. And you're not often in a position of saying no, but you are often in a position of saying, have you considered this alternate approach? Have you considered the implications of this decision? I have this idea for taking it in this direction that I think will meet your goals. And I think that too often we as engineers relieve ourselves of that responsibility and that opportunity. And so
less following orders, more autonomy.
Yeah, with an eye to the bigger system, I think. The idea that you as an individual contributor need to understand the system within which you work and the implications of your code.
That's great. I really like that. Well, Sarah Allen, thank you for coming on to Software Engineering Daily. It's been fantastic talking to you.
It's been great talking to you too.